And so consciousness interacts with chaos to produce order. And if it's truthful and attentive consciousness, then the order it produces from chaos is good. That's the next proposition. And that's a daring proposition. It's an ethical proposition. So the first proposition in Genesis is like an ontological or epistemological proposition. It's sort of about the nature of reality. But the second is an ethical proposition. And it's a really interesting one. And I think this is, I don't know if there's a more interesting question that you can ask yourself. It's like, because the proposition is that what you bring into the world when you interact with chaos, what is brought into the world in the interaction with chaos as a consequence of truth, if that's what's embodied in the logos, is by definition good. And so one of the things I've been suggesting to my audiences, it's one of the rules in my book, is that well, you should tell the truth, or at least you shouldn't lie. It's like, you can't tell the truth because what the hell do you know? But you cannot lie. You know, like each of us knows when we're about to utter something that isn't true. Now sometimes maybe you're confused about it because you're ignorant and you're biased and so you say something and it might be true and it might not be, but you're not clear about it. But sometimes it's pretty damn clear that you say something or you do something that you know perfectly well not to be true, and you do it anyways. And the proposition that Genesis puts forward is, if you act in truth, then the order you produce is good, regardless of how it appears. It's an axiomatic statement of ethical, it's an axiomatic ethical proposition that the job of whatever extracts order from chaos is properly done if it's done in truth. And that's worth thinking about because it might be true. And then the question is like, well, do you believe it's true? That's a good question. It's not a religious question even, it's a practical question as far as I'm concerned. And my sense is that people just believe that this is true, deeply. And the way you can tell that is not by what they say, but by what they do. And so, for example, one of the things that you might observe is that, you know, if you love someone, your children, let's say, you don't tell them that the best way to get through the world is to lie about everything all the time. You don't sit them down and say, look, this is a corrupt enterprise, and altogether, and you can't trust anyone because they're always lying about everything. And your job is to become the best liar you possibly can become, because that's the way to get to where you need to get to and to set the world straight. No one ever does that. And so if they don't do that, which would be belief in the lie, then they must assume something that's approximately opposite. And I would say that most people are not pleased when they catch their children in a lie. And so then you have to ask, well, why is that? It has to be because people believe that the truth is the proper way to proceed. And it isn't obvious why they believe that, but it's obvious that they act as if they do believe that. And then I would also say, well, there's more to it than that, because we know, for example, that societies that have a high level of trust, and there aren't that many of those in the world, they happen to almost all be Western societies, where there's a high level of trust, there's a high level of economic development. They're unbelievably highly associated. And I've never been able to figure out how countries ever became not corrupt. Like, it just seems completely impossible to me for countries that were corrupt once to ever become not corrupt. I don't understand how that happens at all. But there's a handful of countries in the world that are fundamentally not corrupt, where your default presupposition when you deal with a stranger, let's say in a financial transaction, is that you don't have to be on guard like you're investigating a pit of vipers, because the person is likely to act out what they say they'll do. And it reduces the transaction, the unnecessary transaction costs, to about zero, right? Because I can take you at your word. We don't know each other, I can take you at your word. A good example of that is eBay, because eBay was stranger transactions, and people were concerned it would degenerate into an unplayable game, and turned out that the default trade on eBay was, like, if you have 98% seller rating on eBay, you're actually a crook. You need 99% or above. It's so high, it's unbelievable. So we do know that trust is necessary. We do assume that people shouldn't lie. We are upset if our children don't tell the truth. We feel that that's a moral failing. But we're not very courageous because we won't live out the full implications of that. So the third part of Genesis that I'd like to concentrate on very briefly is the part that makes the Declaration of Independence self-evident, and that is that man and woman alike are made in the image of God. And that's a very mysterious statement because, well, first of all, it seems on the face of it absurd, partly because it turns God into something approximating a person, because there's an equation there, and it's not obvious what that might mean. But it's also not clear what being made in the image of God would mean, given that by that point in the book you don't know much about God, except that you do know that he uses logos to extract order out of chaos. That's about all you know, and that's good. And so the proposition there, as far as I'm concerned, is that that's what human beings do. That's what we do. And that this is way more important than people think, that we are co-creators of reality. Now you think, well, do you believe that? Well, let's think about that for a minute or two. It's like, the standard scientists, they tend to think of human beings as materialist and deterministic. And I don't think that works very well for consciousness. I don't think there's any evidence that it works as an explanation for consciousness at all. And I think consciousness is self-evident. I mean, we certainly act as if it's self-evident. You act like you're conscious. You act like all the people around you are conscious. They're not happy if you don't act like they're conscious, that's for sure. You're not going to get along with yourself or your family members or society at large if you don't treat people like they're conscious. You're also not going to get along with any of them unless you treat them like they are active agents that have some role in determining their own destiny, right? I mean, God, you see that in 2-year-olds, when they're already pushing for autonomy. And so we make these assumptions that, well, we have this capacity for autonomous choice. And I'm going to split an argument into 2 parts here. The first thing is, I don't think that we can be deterministic, because it looks like neurobiologically that if you want to run deterministically, like on habit, which would be what deterministically would be, you have to practice and practice and practice and practice and practice and build all the machinery that allows you to act deterministically, and then there'll be a stimulus and the whole deterministic process will lay itself out. But that doesn't happen unless you've built the machinery. So like if you're a tennis pro, you're acting deterministically all the time because you don't have enough time to consciously decide what you're going to do when a ball is coming at you so fast you can't actually see it properly. It's all reflex, but it's really complicated chains of reflexes, and you spent like 10,000 hours building them. And so fine, and when you're driving your car, or you're walking, you're doing these things that you've practiced so well, you're deterministic. But when you encounter the chaos of the day, that's a whole different story. And so what consciousness seems to do actually is to act when deterministic processes aren't at hand. So we could walk through that. We could say, look